Welcome to Podomation, where we talk about all things automation and industrial cybersecurity. Podomation is brought to you by ISA, the International Society of Automation.
Welcome to the next episode of Podomation. I'm Morgan Ford and I'll be your host today. The landscape of maritime cybersecurity has evolved significantly, driven by current events, increasing digitization, and the adoption of emerging technologies. These changes enhance operational capabilities, but also introduce vulnerabilities. Regulation and standards introductions have been pivotal in guiding integration of cyber risk management into safety management systems on board ships. However, a primary concern in maritime cybersecurity is operational technology systems, which are vital to the control and operations of physical shipboard processes. Let's explore this topic more with our guests. Guys, thanks for joining us today. Please take the time to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Kevin Duffy. I'm CEO of the global security consultancy Maritime Imperative. Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, Marco Ayala. I'm the president of Infragard Houston. Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, I'm Michael DeVolld. I'm a senior principal consultant with ABS Group. And for those not familiar with the acronym, that's American Bureau of Shipping. Thanks for having me.
And I'm Sean Plankey. I'm the global head of cybersecurity software at WTW. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us, guys. Let's start a conversation with the state of maritime cybersecurity. Kevin, what do you see as some of the largest emerging threats?
So I'll just broaden your question a little bit there to talk about maritime security generally, because I think it's really important when we talk about cyber to consider it within the context of all of the other threats and activities that are happening. So when we talk about the global maritime trading system, that offers and fluctuates year by year an estimated $14 trillion worth to the global economy. So that affects every country in the world, coastal states, non-coastal states that receive goods that come off a ship and conveyed in any other manner to get there. So it's a tremendous benefit, and really the modern society globally and in individual nations we have today would not be possible without it. So that's the benefit, is that it's just so gargantuan and it means so much to economic well-being worldwide. But that same reason is what makes it susceptible to attack, because there's really two main reasons why threat actors would attack ports or shipping at sea, and that would be to get some of that value for themselves, so to profit themselves, or to the second one would be to impose costs on adversaries who benefit from the system. So to the first, which is those seeking to profit through illicit activities or threatening maritime activity, we can think of things, so in the cyber domain, ransomware attacks. So this would be a cyber attack shuts down a port or disables part of the functioning of a port. And the proposition is you would pay the actor to cease the attack and reopen the port. So we've seen major attacks at major ports in the past year or so, in Japan, Portugal, other places throughout the world. There's an analogous form of this in a much more traditional physical way, right? Which is piracy, which is the traditional way where threat actors attack a ship at sea, and they do that so they can either take the cargo for themselves and get that profit, or ransom back the ship and its crew for profit. More recently, we've seen that model be used by modern terrorist threat actors. So if you look at the Abu Sayyaf group, who operated essentially dismantled now, but operated had a real robust operation in the southern Philippines for the first decade or so of the 21st century. They use that model of kidnap, seizing ships at sea for ransom, and that was more to fund their ideologically motivated activities that they had. Even more recently than that, of course, it's all over the headlines. Today would be the Houthi activity in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. They, to this day, hold a ship that they seize in a fairly famous event. They used a helicopter to board and seize it. But the Houthis also, it's worth mentioning, engage in the second form of maritime disruption, which is cost imposition, right? To hurt your adversary by doing this attack, which we see with their rocket, small arm, drone attacks on ships at sea with no real economic benefit for themselves. It's a model that they've borrowed from one of their great sponsors, Iran, who also actively seizes merchant ships. Again, not because they're going to profit from it necessarily. It's more of a cost imposition against who they perceive as their adversaries in the world. They will also, at the same time, use cyber attacks to probe at least their regional allies or disrupt the ports and activities of their regional allies. Perhaps most prominently, the state actor who does engages in a lot of this cyber activity would be Russia, and the one thing that they use it for that I don't think I have mentioned yet would be preparation of a battlefield, right? So it's a cyber attack that will allow for a follow-on kinetic activity, and ports have not been immune to this type of activity. So I'll close with the big takeaway that I want from this kind of opening statement I'm making is the cyber threats in the maritime domain and the other, however you want to term them, kinetic or traditional threats, don't exist in silos separated from each other. So I'll give one last example to kind of drive this home. 2020, there was a cyber incursion at the ports of Rotterdam and Antwerp, and this was not a state prepping a battlefield. It wasn't a terrorist actor or a ransomware attack where the individual expected to get paid. It was an individual operating for a long time, taking the information about how the ports operated, how the various shipping companies use different standards, and selling that information to drug cartels in Latin America, who then could use that information to make decisions about how they use container shipping to smuggle their drugs into Europe. And that's the largest vector for cocaine smuggling into Europe is containerized shipping, which is a huge concern for ports and shipping companies who don't want to be connected to the criminal activity, don't want the actors around threatening or putting their people in danger, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll close with that just to drive home that all the cyber threats that my colleagues who know much more about and the regulatory things they're going to talk about, they're very connected to all of the other threats that we see in the maritime domain, and they shouldn't. We're going to get deep in the weeds on the cyber, but I think we should never forget that it can be used by threat actors for other purposes to facilitate their ends across the spectrum of all threats. So thank you.
Sure. And that's really interesting, Kevin. Thank you for bringing up that point. But, as you were talking about more of the cybersecurity aspect and how things can be separate, can be together, I think a lot of awareness came up on shipping container systems around the events that happened in Baltimore. Marco, can you talk about how asset owners can get assurance that shipyards are managing their OT cybersecurity risk?
Yeah, Morgan. So I think some of the key things there is, Kevin alluded to some things that happened overseas in 2020. We've also seen things here in the U.S. where I think it really starts as that collaboration piece. So whether it's Infragard or working with the local Coast Guard or your CISA reps here, but that coordination, especially in this interconnected world, has been really a saving grace, per se, amongst the ports here in the U.S. and overseas. And so a lot of that starts with global frameworks such as NIST, Cybersecurity Framework, or how that ties into the ISA or IEC set of standards. Really kind of pulling back the curtain and understanding what systems that you have, But more importantly, and this is the biggest piece, is really understanding the people, the process, and the technology that are supporting your system of systems, especially when you start dealing in maritime, whether it's equipment, shipboard systems, or even portside facilities. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of interconnectivity, and there's now, of course, that enterprise connection. So there's a lot of pieces to that. So from an assurance, to go back to your question, it's really trying to identify and perform a risk assessment to identify not only your threat scenarios, your impacts and consequences, but also your scenarios. What are the scenarios that could get to that threshold? And identifying that and documenting that, and working with consultants that you're speaking to right here that have been in the maritime space that can help understand not only what you have, but also that threat vector to get into it. So I think it really comes down to understanding what your company or your corporate perspective from your maritime side is using, whether that's NIST or a global standard such as ISA, IEC, but tying that in and working with your integrators that support your port side, making sure that they have awareness and training and are capable and competent. Sean, you and I, we've talked about this quite often and quite deep into making sure that we're doing the right thing with the right people and the right folks to protect not only the infrastructure here in the U.S., but also across the world with allied countries and trying to protect the maritime space in general. And that could be everything from offshore drilling to offshore production platforms to even portside maritime systems. So cranes, ship-to-shore cranes, RTGs, these are all digital systems that are now fully intertwined. So from a perspective of what you're trying to protect, you have to really scrutinize this from that 10,000 mile up view, but also do that full deep dive into your system to understand where those vulnerabilities lie. But also try to approach it from a defense in-depth strategy. And sometimes in the maritime space, that sounds great in theory, very difficult to do in practice. So I'll let the other folks speak to that because I'm just trying to give a perspective on that from that point. So hopefully that answers your question, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you for going into that. Let's talk about the maritime insurance perspective as well. Sean, how do brokers, insurances assess maritime cybersecurity risk?
Just as Kevin talked about, global trade has been growing to 6 to 9% a year, meaning more ships are out there, more cargoes traversing, and the same thing happens in insurance, right? It's been growing roughly about 6% a year in the maritime space as well. So when we think about the cyber component of it, usually what happens is you insure your hull and your liability. You can insure individual cargo aspect. And then on top of that, you would have a cyber insurance piece of that, of your policy set that provides you, risk mitigation across it. And in the insurance space, what we see is largely checklists or compliance mechanisms that say, hey, here, are you following these compliance frameworks, or are you can you certify these things off of a checklist saying that you have certain security measures in place? The interesting thing about that is, as you can imagine, it's highly subjective, and it's a single moment in time, for the insurance piece. But if you look at the average age, let's say, of like global fleets, 22 years is how old an average ship is. And then 28 years, it goes up to 28 years for smaller ships, and it goes down to about 15 years for the larger vessels. And also, 45% of all that tonnage is coming out of Asia, and 90 to 95% of all the ships are being built out of China, Korea, South Korea, or Japan. So I bring that up and I caveat that because when you're building a ship or you're refitting a ship or you're having a ship worked on, you generally are putting in your let's call your digital terrain, all your connectivity, your wires, your cables, your computers, and all that. It doesn't get built, like the steel part doesn't get built in, let's say, China and then sailed across the ocean, and then you add all your digital stuff. No, all of that stuff gets put in the same location, including your security aspects if we're talking about a ship individually. And then I wanted to highlight the other piece is also we've seen significant growth in offshore wind as well. So there's still offshore platforms that's considered in the maritime space as well, and then offshore wind. And all of these things still go by the same idea of, hey, you want to insure this? Well, I'm going to ask you to look at this criteria for assessment, this document that says, do you have security here? Do you have security there? What are you doing for X, Y, and Z? You're going to fill it out. Your security team is going to fill it out, and then we're going to take it back and we'll broker you or decide to fill insurance in a way that's provides you some sort of risk mitigation as you as the owner. But I think that's relevant because we're still in a non-technical way of assessing risk in a digital environment, right? So we know that I could go, let's say, inspect the ship, and let's say it was being built in China, and it says, hey, we put in these pieces of digital terrain, and then when that ship finally goes out to sea or hits the yard, it may not be in the same state that it was in when we did the initial assessment. And that's just the reality of building a ship. It's the reality of the time it takes to bring that ship to sea. But that changes let's say your risk profile from a cybersecurity aspect.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Marco, you are a longtime training instructor at ISA. Can you talk about using ISA IEC 62443 methodology to assess risk as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at a lot of the actual classifications around maritime, whether that's DNV or even the ABS group here, they use 62443 baked underneath the hood for example, their program. So as an instructor, when I'm teaching, I get folks from all industries, whether it's rail, oil, gas, chemical, but especially maritime. They're able to identify that and say, hey, we're following 62443, and we also meet the intent of, say, DNV or ABS within the systems, right? Zones and conduits and so forth. So from an instructor's perspective, it's really good because I'm seeing asset owners or technicians coming in from some of the large ship operators that are really interested in learning around the 62443 as a global standard. So they're also getting not only the hands-on perspective of the systems that they see typically offshore, but also some of the things that are seen from an onshore perspective. So as an instructor, it's a little bit easier for me to try to convince them to use a standard or a framework that ties not only to NIST and globally, to IEC, but it's especially even better when they see that within their own classifications. And even with new ship builds, Michael and Sean could probably get into that a little further, but one of the things that the students really come out of with a full understanding is addressing risk and using 62443, like the 3-2, as a guide into actually performing risk assessments. So I've been teaching it since 2016 as an instructor for ISA, and I've had folks from not only the Navy side and Coast Guard side, but also trained National Guard around the standards and given some hands-on. So it's nice to see that this is rolling out, especially from an ISA perspective. So.
Awesome. Well, now that we've talked about risk and using ISA standards, I'd love to engage a little bit more about government policy for maritime cybersecurity. Sean, given your experience, can you give us an overview of the proposed rulemaking USCG 220802 executive order? What's new, what's good, what's not so good?
Sure. So going back in time a little bit, I'm going to bring us back. There was an item written called the National Maritime Cybersecurity Plan that came out in the previous administration. And that formed the basis on what evolved to today to an executive order from President Biden, and then also a notice of proposed rulemaking from the Coast Guard. The notice of proposed rulemaking seeks to provide a regulatory aspect to saying that you will now consider cybersecurity issues in your port and maritime environment, right? So that means your ship or your or your port. The interesting thing about that, the proposed rulemaking, is it specifically goes at U.S. flagged vessels and U.S. owned vessels, which unfortunately there's not many, right? There's not many U.S. owned vessels. There's not many U.S. There's even ports and port terminals in the U.S. that are not owned by the U.S. So there's some question about regulatory environment there on this rulemaking. Yes, it's going to provide a cybersecurity posture and a requirement, but how broad it actually gets when the majority of the ships coming in and out of the United States are not U.S. flagged vessels. So
Exactly.
The second point on that is it requires assessments. And it almost as if it takes a page out of what we do in the insurance industry, because it's requiring that you write up an assessment for a moment in time. Again, in that moment in time, you then send your assessment into the Coast Guard headquarters, which will then decide if you have the right security posture that you need and certify you. So then you meet the security standards required in the potential rulemaking that's coming up. Some of the what's good about all this is you're doing something to raise a baseline of cybersecurity, right? Where there was previously nothing, it was questionable on any sort of enforcement. There is now, a level set. What I see is what's not so good on it is these assessments that are required for things like change in ownership on the proposed rulemaking, but they're not required if you go get your ship rebuilt in an adversarial country such as China, right? It's not required that you have a new assessment done there, which could be a problem, right? Because you can change your digital terrain. Another not so good issue I see is you're sending this checklist, this paper form, into some office in Coast Guard headquarters. Who are the people that are doing the assessment? We don't know who they are, what their qualifications are, what's their experience in industry, right? Are we actually raising the cybersecurity standard, or are we doing a paperwork drill? That's a question. That's something the Coast Guard has to explain. And then finally, the other piece I'd say is the people that are coming out to the ships or the port environment, from the Coast Guard perspective, there's still a large question on what is their what we would call pipeline training, or what is their security training and standards that they're being versed in. Are they are they more well versed in cybersecurity than the owner operator facility? Are they less well versed? Do they understand? Are they speaking the same language? Right? We could have somebody that's gone through, let's say, some level of ISA training, for instance, on the owner operator side, and on the Coast Guard side, they really don't have any cybersecurity background, so they might not even speak the same language when they're talking about cybersecurity. So I think that this proposed rulemaking needs to evolve a little bit more to tell the public, hey, the people that will be enforcing the standard maintain a level of credentialing that's acceptable on both sides, so they can speak the same language, and then eliminate what I would call black holes or gaps in policy that say, hey, you just send this to this office and we'll take care of it. Who knows what's really behind that door, right?
Yeah, I think these are great points. Dealing with exclusions in the rulemaking, let's take a little bit further of a dive into this. How can ISA 62443 risk-based approach to cybersecurity be used to help address the challenge? Michael, we haven't heard a lot from you today, so I really want to get you engaged with this too.
Well, I've been listening intently. There's so much going on in the regulatory sphere of maritime. I mean, you have Coast Guard notice of proposed rulemaking. You have the IMO, Maritime Cybersecurity guidelines, right? That are going up for review here in May in London, and they're really adding a lot more detail to those. And before, in my previous job, I worked for a global cruise industry company, and I got to see a lot of this firsthand. A little bit of insight to what's happening. This builds off what you're talking about, Sean, because it's not just U.S. Coast Guard, it's global port state, it's classification societies, it's flag state inspections. And what happens is it's really driven off IMO, in my opinion. And IMO put out guidelines, and flag states such as the U.S. will elect to make them mandatory. So you may have a port state inspector going on board, trying to assess the cybersecurity of a vessel from a ISM perspective, International Safety Management. You may have a port state regulator in Europe or Singapore or Korea going on and trying to do the same thing. And they have varying levels of background and experience. Assessments do require boots on deck on a vessel and at facilities, but that assessor has to have some level of experience and credentials, to your point, Sean. Otherwise, you're asking irrelevant and confusing questions to the people on the vessels. Another issue is the level of knowledge of the folks operating the vessel. If you look at the IMO guidelines and some of the language in the NPRM, talks a lot about training, not just basic cybersecurity awareness training. It's technical training. It's how to recognize a cyber incident. It's how to make sure controls are in place. And until all these things start working together, we have a long road ahead of us, to really bring the industry up to another level. And to answer your question, what I like about the IEC 62443 is it's really a holistic approach, right? So whether you're, there's no one size fits all approach in maritime. You could be a cruise ship, you could be a tank ship, you could be a bulk carrier. Same goes for ports and facilities. Every company and operation is going to have different levels of risk. They're going to have systems within their organizations that are different levels of criticality. And the business needs to decide, how to approach that risk, how to resource that risk. And you can set your levels, right, based tailored to your business needs. And I really think if you focus there, then you're going to get to good cybersecurity protection of your unique individual organization. But on the flip side of that, the folks auditing and assessing these vessels and port facilities, they have to understand that concept as well, because it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, and this is a really good point. But to further go back into some of the things that you were talking about, the legislation that's coming through in London in May, we're having ISA's Operational Technology Cybersecurity Summit in London in June, and we're definitely going to be going over that because it's a really big thing that's coming through for Europe and surrounding countries. So thank you for bringing that up. But let's get back into more of our discussion here. There's so much information out there on policy and from academia. People don't really know which way to go. We've all heard a whole bunch of different things, even through this conversation. So some of the information is great in theory, horrible in practice, the words of Marco Ayala. Can you guys give me an industry example of where this applies?
Sure. Where do we start? Oil and gas, so many different guidelines, right? Guidelines, standards, discussions, different groups, different industry organizations. And obviously the academia is really coming into it. And one of the things that you find the most lacking, especially from a field experience and expertise, as Michael was alluding to, is finding folks that are actually trained in operational technology or industrial control systems or maritime control systems that are everything from propulsion, engine control, navigation, vessel management systems. It's a very, very niche understanding. And so from a security perspective and standpoint, what we see a lot from the academia is they get quite a bit of the cybersecurity pieces right, but how they actually fit into operational technology, it's not always adequate, or it may be misaligned. And so what doesn't help to that, and Sean, you and I talked about this before along with Michael, is trying to harmonize all of these things coming in from left field from the government and CERCIA and reporting, and now your NPRM, where there might be a lot of prescriptive discussions, just trying to get it all to make sense to where the impacts to operational technology, it doesn't have impact to operational technology is a better way of saying it. So for me, that where I use the term, it's great in theory, horrible in practice, is making sure you don't shoot yourself in the foot by deploying out security strategies that are going to impact your maritime, your ship-to-shore communications, whatever it may be, that are crucially needed for operational mission assurance. And so I speak to this real deep and highly, is that we have to make sure that we're doing the right things with the right people that are not only trained, but are enabled to be able to do that. So that's kind of my spill on that piece of it. And you see this across other industries. So like Michael could probably talk to you even more on the cruise industry.
Yeah, I have a couple. Pet peeves in our industry. One thing is, I think we should be, careful about the scenarios we present, especially coming out of academia. I think we've all seen it in one form or another, and it goes something like, a captain gets a phishing email, something gets compromised, and one thing leads to another, and someone remotely is steering a ship into a rock or a bridge or something. And the reality is, could that happen? Maybe, very slim chance, but more likely is, and what maybe some folks that don't have the operational experience don't understand, is there is multiple levels of human protection on these vessels. You have pilots on board, you have captains on board, you have restricted maneuvering policies and procedures where things are put in a manual mode with things on standby in case something happens. And so, I think we need to be realistic about the scenarios that can happen so we can have the real conversations about what needs to be done. As far as, and then the recommendations that come with that, especially on the OT side, whether that's, using an antivirus, patching as quickly as possible, changing password complexity. What people don't realize is a lot of this is controlled from the vendor side. You simply cannot manage this on your own as an asset owner. And it takes things like contract language, service agreements with the vendor, and you have to be patient. You have to wait on these things, and you have to manage your risk through defense in depth and other methods. Remote connectivity is another thing. Remote connectivity is actually an extremely important safety catch. There's been scenarios where ships are underway and they need that remote connection to make a repair, have a vendor do some diagnostics. So it's a delicate balance there between you're not overprotecting the vessels or facilities, but finding that right balance. And I think we all need to get better at working with vendors and the government and all the regulations and guidelines coming out to make sure we get that right.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michael. Sean?
Sure. I think that conflicting information goes a lot into coordination and response piece from the government side of the house. What I mean by that is, you have when you look at the maritime industry, over 30% of all cargo is energy related, right? So they're carrying some sort of fuel capacity, or it's an offshore oil rig, or it's an offshore wind platform, something along those lines. And you think about it from the government perspective. Well, if they're oil and they're connected to a pipeline, that could be a TSA issue, or maybe Department of Energy issue, or still a maritime issue with the Coast Guard, and then there's Department of Transportation, what's involved as well. And we have all these different agencies. If you think there's a criminal activity involved, you're calling FBI. CISA is supposed to be, another element there to support you as well. And then if you think it's a national security issue, as something in maritime largely could be due to the critical infrastructure nature and the larger impact that a mishap or casualty could have on an economic output of a country, region, port, area, like you're going to have what? You're going to have the Department of Defense involved, the National Security Agency, something like that, right? Because they are supposed to protect us from attacks by other nations or attacks by other by terrorists. And so when you have this variety pack, it's like who do you go to? Who's supposed to help you? Who even has like cyber capability to respond and diagnose what's going on? And I think that just leads into things that people say, oh, it's great in theory. The government's like, this is great. We're sharing, we're coordinating information, and meanwhile, the industry, who by the way is likely a foreign flagged, right, foreign owned, foreign flagged entity, they're like, hey, I don't know your government. There's too many places to call. How do I keep everybody informed? It's a job in and of itself. So you're not responding to your issue, but you're instead trying to diagnose or handle coordination across the U.S. government. And I think that's largely a problem that, in academia, we do these games, war games, or scenarios that we think we figured out. And we really don't, because we don't have that industry experience. And actually, I think that's where Kevin could give some valuable input in terms of what we have is what the government establishes a thing called a MORR call. And Kevin, can you maybe highlight what that was and how it was created and used? Maybe there's a capacity there for that.
So MORR is an acronym, as the government always likes to give us. That's Maritime Operational Threat Response. So MOTR, MORR, and it's a process or a mechanism for coordination across agencies and departments of the U.S. government when there is a maritime incident or situation. Basically, a series of calls that bring all the stakeholders in. Designated lead agency of it. There's a coordinator, there's an office that coordinates at the Global Maritime Coordination Center. But basically, everybody can come in and say what they bring to the table, what their plans are, their capabilities are, maybe their limitations. And it's actually been used pretty extensively with a great amount of success. However, the situations for which it has been used are things like a stowaway of concern, a migrant situation, maybe a drug situation. You can imagine if there's a report of a communicable disease, feeding off the kind of pandemic theme that we just went through, and it's inbound to the United States. It's really effective when agencies can come in and say, maybe the lines of who's going to do what is not clear, but the lines of the capability that everybody brings to the table is very clear. So if there's got to be a criminal aspect, will that be Homeland Security investigations, or that be the FBI? Or if we got to get a ship there, is it better the Coast Guard, or maybe there's a naval asset that can get there? Probably where the concern or the weakness would be if you've got this the situation that Sean set up, where you've got this outside stakeholder, maybe not responsive to U.S. regulations or interests, or really at its root a cyber situation. There's nothing to guarantee that the representatives the various agencies and departments bring to the table on that call have any background in that whatsoever. So maybe by policy and process, we're shaping ourselves towards kind of analog solutions to digital problems, depending on how deep in the regulatory or cyber domain we get. I don't know if that captures what Sean was thinking.
Yeah, the one thing I do think is interesting though on a motor call, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you get on, when all the departments and agencies get on and they're forced to get on this call, they have to agree that someone is the lead entity, right? And I feel like we don't see that yet in cyber, right? You'll have 17 different agencies call the same person to coordinate on an event, when it's like on a motor call, you're at least getting like, this is the lead agency, lead entity, which helps from an industry perspective, because at least you only have one point of contact, right? And I think it clarifies, or behind the scenes owns who's in charge. And I'll bring up, for instance, like the Port of Baltimore issue that we just had, where the vessel ran into the bridge. The irony that I think of that is the public-facing entity in that whole event has been Governor Wes Moore, but he actually has no authority over any of the things involved there. He doesn't control the port. He doesn't control the bridge. He doesn't control anything except maybe like the fire department involved. But he's the lead entity speaking outwards. And I think that type of stuff creates confusion in the environment of who's really in charge and who's running it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't a motor call establish that single focal point?
Sure. You're trying to kind of what at, talking about if there's an investigation, Homeland Security, HSI, they could do it, or the FBI could do it, or the DEA could do it. And it's meant to get agreement on who's going to play what role. So who's going to be the lead, or if it's at sea is the probably who can get there first, right? Would it be the Navy or the Coast Guard? So meant to establish those roles and everything, and holds promise for the type of situation that you're talking about. But I don't know that it's been or we have a proof of concept
right.
With that type of situation yet in the motor process.
Wow. Well, this is a lot of heavy information that we're talking about here as to how all this stuff folds out. And it's really interesting to see how everything is now. We can sit and pinpoint details all day. It sounds like you guys are super passionate about every single one. So I love it. I think this is a great conversation. But just to kind of bring it home, let's bring up something positive to end on. So I'll ask each of you to just say what you were most positive about with maritime cybersecurity at this point.
I'll go first. I'll say I'm most positive maritime cybersecurity is that it's being recognized as something that can happen. Maritime cybersecurity a long time had a lot of naysayers saying it couldn't happen, can't be a cyber event, they're not vulnerable, ships at sea. There was a large disconnect between what cyber could really impact and what those outcomes were, right? Because I think people thought for a long time cyber was like the movies where you had to have some major explosion for something to occur. And they're like, well, that can't happen in my port. And now people are realizing that a cyber event may be much more benign, but can still have like an economic impact that is equally severe. And that you don't have to be, a massive computer to have it happen, right? A connected device, even unconnected devices that are running off things like GPS, can still be vulnerable to a cyber event. So the fact that we're starting, that we're setting this floor, that the government's going to be involved and recognize this, that's probably the positive for me.
Yeah, I agree, Sean. I think a lot of the positive as well is, especially here in the U.S., are the area maritime security committees that that are jointly with the U.S. Coast Guard is, we've been doing cybersecurity exercises for the past 6-8 years as part of a module for Outer Continental Shelf, Gulf of Mexico, also here in the southern region. I know the other area maritime security committees are doing that as well. So some of the positives that I see is that it's driving awareness not only as the asset owners or the vessel owners, but also the ports and even the colleges are starting to shape maritime security programs around cyber, focused around your traditional IT and also building out curriculum around operational technology. Not real big deep dives into it just yet, but I'm positive they're going to get there, especially with the help from folks that are here on this call, seeding information to them as well. Some of the other things that I'm really positive about are that collaboration, but also folks that are adopting ISA, IEC 62443 from risk methodology, also design and implementation, making sure that your maritime systems are designed appropriately from a risk reduction factor and understanding what security levels are, not just what the targets you can set, but also what systems are capable and how you can get through to making sure that you can try to reach an achieve state. This is not overnight success. This is going to take time. So I think maritime industry is quite aware of that. And then the other part of it too is that training piece. But for me, the positive is trying to get that harmonization globally with IMO, with Coast Guard from the maritime perspective, but creating this risk-based performance standards, I think is really important for this. So we don't have impact. So I'm positive that maritime is going to be more secure in the long run over time. So it's not anything new. I'm going to say that it's, security risks from cyber perspective are not new. It's just gained a lot of attention here in the last few years because of the impacts. So that's what I've got to say.
All right, I'll go next. 100% agree with what both Sean and Marco said, and I'll add on to it as a former regulator when I was active duty Coast Guard. I'm inspired by what I see coming out in terms of regulation. In maritime, they say regulations are written in blood and oil. And that's true. All the way back to the Titanic, Exxon Valdez, Deepwater Horizon, you name it, people have lost their lives, or we've had a major environmental disaster before change was impacted. And let's not wait to get there. I know we have a long road ahead to really effectively implement regulation, but I think light touch regulation is needed. What I'm seeing come out of IMO is more operational focus, which is where it should be. They're putting it under the International Safety Management Code, so it's a big focus on training and preparedness and resiliency, which is easy to do for an asset owner. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. On the flip side, with the classification societies, shipbuilding, you have the IACS, International Association for Classification Societies, putting out some really good requirements for new ships that goes into effect June of this year for new builds contracted. And those requirements are rooted in ISA 62443, and it's really going to make sure the new fleets coming out are delivered in a sound fashion in terms of cybersecurity. And then it's going to be up to the asset owner to maintain that through the life of the ship, which can be very long. But I'm excited to see some movement on the regulatory side and just all the conversations like this. I think we need more information sharing. I'm starting to see that with the MTS, ISAC, Infragard, and other organizations. So I think it's only up from here.
Kevin?
Okay, yeah. So I'll kind of circle back to the theme I kind of started with, which is the global importance and benefits of the maritime trade. So if you look at just one merchant ship at sea, you see this microcosm of globalization, right? The crew members are going to be from different countries. It's going to be registered in a flag of another country. The operator is going to be based in a different country than that, and the owners are the ownership is going to be a company based in a different country with maybe stakeholders or co-owners from 4 or 5 different countries, which is all to say, given that and given the vast benefits of well-functioning ports and safe, secure, open maritime trade, those who would attack and disrupt it will quickly find themselves out of supporters and allies. It's not to say the threats don't exist. The threats will be persistent, but Marco just touched on, and Michael as well. There's strong industry interest and capability. There's strong international organization interest and capability, and there's the broadest possible coalition of nations who are deeply invested in keeping our ports and our shipping safe and secure and functioning well, because it benefits us all so much. So I think the greatest strength that we have when we're talking about, thorny problems to tackle, but there's so many stakeholders interested in tackling them successfully.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. If anyone would want a larger deep dive discussion into maritime cybersecurity, Sean and Kevin are going to be presenting on it at the Barcelona Cybersecurity Congress on 23 May. Encourage anyone wanting additional information to check that out. But that's it for Podomation, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
This has been Podomation, brought to you by the International Society of Automation. Thanks for listening, and remember to subscribe and review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people to find our content. Podomation is produced by me, Liz Neiman, and Morgan Fora at ISA. Our music is by Mixer Drummer and has been licensed from Pond 5.